For the longest time, when we would talk about the subject of toxic masculinity, we would remark on the fact that you never hear anything about the comparative term toxic femininity. Of course, pointing out anything negative coming from women is heresy, but tearing down all of men's flaws is completely fair game, right? So a little while ago, when I was dragged, quite unwillingly as usual, into yet another Twitter discussion, I was surprised to see someone mention that there is indeed a concept called toxic femininity, and that it is a similarly important topic to discuss. So I looked into it. Do you think that I found that the term was talking about all the negative traits that tend to be more associated with those of a feminine persuasion? Believe it or not so much. Let's talk about that on today's episode of Men's Mental Health. Hello once again from the Prim Reaper. So I'm sure by now that most of you are familiar with the concept of toxic masculinity, but just for the sake of comparison, let's look at a general overview. In modern society, people often use the term toxic masculinity to describe exaggerated masculine traits that many cultures have widely accepted or glorified. This harmful concept of masculinity also places significant importance on manliness based on strength, lack of emotion, self-sufficiency, dominance, sexual virility. According to traditional toxic masculine values, a male who does not display enough of these traits may fall short of being a real man. Overemphasis of these traits may lead to harmful imbalances in someone trying to live up to these expectations. Some examples include aggression, sexual aggression or control, showing no emotion or suppressing emotions, hypercompetitiveness, needing to dominate or control others, a tendency towards or glorification of violence, isolation, low empathy, entitlement, chauvinism, and sexism. So, you know the drill. It's all the usual sort of thing. Taking traits typically associated with men or maleness and talking about their capacity for being problematic, and usually without any corresponding discussion on how these traits may be helpful or may have some demonstrable function or even biological basis that isn't heavily influenced by societal expectations. Now, what was one of the first things I encountered when I searched for the supposed sister concept, toxic femininity? Women expressing stereotypically feminine traits such as passivity, empathy, sensuality, patience, tenderness, and receptivity, which result in individuals ignoring their mental or physical needs to sustain those around them. Toxic femininity is when one works to the benefit of others but to the detriment of themselves. It can appear as forms of depression, exhaustion, or wildly illogical solutions to complex problems. By to the benefit of others, writers nearly always mean to the benefit of men. Oh my goodness me, I am so surprised. So just to summarize, toxic masculinity, all the behaviors that display aggression, violence, and even hateful behavior towards others. Behaviors that are, apparently normalized, accepted, and even sometimes fostered by broader societal attitudes. Versus toxic femininity, all the ways in which women are just so giving and generous of self, especially to men, that they just burn their poor little selves out and make themselves depressed. Yes, these seem like totally equivalent concepts. I'm so glad that we can all talk about this in good faith. But in all seriousness, there is so much wrong with this that it's difficult finding the best way to tease it apart. Let's perhaps start with the most obvious thing. The matter that these definitions are obviously extremely unbalanced and are not addressing truly toxic behaviors of both sexes in a fair way. I think if we all try really hard, we can come up with just a few more toxic behaviors that women might be more prone to display, on average, than men. Relational or passive aggression, helplessness, judgmental behavior, to name a few. This is, of course, assuming we want to follow this line of thinking that problematic behaviors ought to be sex-linked, which brings me to my next point. Another thing I usually criticize whenever this topic comes up, the problem with associating problematic behaviors with a given sex rather than just focusing on the problem behavior itself. Someone who has a problem with hyper-competitiveness or sexual aggression is not displaying toxic masculinity. They have a problem with hyper-competitiveness or sexual aggression. Nor, under any reasonable line of thinking, should anyone consider someone who works to the benefit of others to the detriment of themselves to be having a toxic femininity problem, whether they are a woman or a man. After all, acting as though women are not capable of aggression, violence, or hateful behavior, or that men are not capable of giving so much of themselves that they burn out, is so ignorant that I honestly have trouble fathoming it. Even if someone does not personally know of a woman or a man like that, it's not really difficult to find examples of them. Should this not be enough to show that these concepts are extremely flawed? Or are we just meant to state that the men and women in these scenarios are just displaying the toxic gendered behavior of the other sex? As if that's not even more insulting and ridiculous. Go ahead and tell any given group of women that an exceptionally patient and empathetic male boss who burns himself out trying to be there for his employees is displaying toxic femininity, and just watch what happens. But hey, speaking of anything to do with talking about toxic femininity, I tried looking around to see what other sites had to say on the subject. Lo and behold, when I found an article talking about actual examples of what might be more commonly considered toxic behavior coming mainly from women, like gossiping or being judgmental, again, if you must go the route that these behaviors are sex-linked, women in the comments were quick to dismiss these as instead being examples of internalized misogyny or products of the patriarchy. Ugh, stop. I can only roll my eyes so hard. Hey, maybe that's a good example of toxic femininity. This absolute inability to stop deflecting responsibility for any negative or problematic behavior whatsoever. But all snarkiness aside, it drives me absolutely nuts that rather than trying to move away from needlessly reductive concepts like toxic masculinity, we're actually doubling down and trying to create some kind of equivalent concept on the other side to make for even more lazy reductive thinking. And not only that, but we're doing it in the most disingenuous way where we're still actually refusing to admit that, believe it or not, women are just as capable of toxic behaviors as men are. Or, and hear me out here because I know this is a wild one, that it may just be better and less divisive for everyone involved if we were to just look at problematic behaviors as they manifest in an individual's life in the context of their circumstances without trying to apply that behavior to one of the immutable categories to which they belong. No? Too difficult? Okay, that's cool, I guess. At least it gives us something to talk about on this episode of Men's Mental Health.